Hello, my name is Liz Booth, and I am the editor of Africa Ahead.
And I am Cass Hansa, former group head, underwriting and claims at Continental Re.
Together, we welcome you to Insurance Matters, a new insurance-inspired podcast by Africans, for Africans, and dealing with African issues. Join us as we explore real-life stories, true and often surprising, inspired by and linked to the continent's insurance sector, a sector we feel is often overlooked when we think about Africa. Each episode will have its own, sometimes unexpected theme. Plus, we'll be joined by some renowned experts whose deep knowledge of the sector will help us connect the dots and find out why insurance is likely to have more relevance to our day-to-day lives here in Africa than we might think. Insurance, why so niche? We know that too few Africans buy into the concept of insurance. But why is that? And is there anything that consumers would like the industry to do that would result in a change of perspective? To discuss this, we have Vusi Thembekwayo, a South African entrepreneur and broadcaster. Welcome, Vusi. Nice to be online with you.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
I think we first met at the Institute of Risk Management South Africa's annual conference, didn't we? Were you again this year? Were you there? Did you attend it?
We did indeed, yeah, at IRMSA. No, I didn't attend this year. I don't live in South Africa full time anymore, so my program in South Africa is quite scant these days.
Oh, okay. No, I missed it this year as well, which was a great shame because I think it's a good event. But I know that the IRMSA members are mostly risk managers, and so they represent some of South Africa's largest corporate and industry organizations, and they do buy insurance. They buy a lot of corporate cover. But do you think it's even a reluctant spend even for them?
No, I think that for larger organizations and corporates, listed companies and big businesses in particular in South Africa, there's generally a very high culture of compliance insofar as buying risk protection. I think they understand the risks, and I think the industry is fairly well entrenched in terms of its ability to help organizations mitigate those risks. There's also been sufficient incidences where the industry has had to step up and prove that it can meet that which is committed to customers, and it's done so several times. So there tends to be a fairly high culture of compliance from the large businesses.
And I mean, do you think how important do you think insurance is that mitigation tool? Because I again, when I'm there, it seems like it really is that they really understand the value of it. But then they, I remember being at an event and one of them had to leave in a hurry because her house was on fire. And I kind of quipped, well, obviously good luck with kind of sorting it out. But I kind of quipped as she left, well, at least you'll be insured. And she said, no, I don't have insurance for my own house. I just have it for the business, which was quite a revelation to me, I have to admit.
Experience. I think if I were to come at it differently, I would say that in particular in the South African context, but also more generally in the African context, that there are so many issues that the average person is dealing with, which are nearer to their lived reality insofar as they present a present danger, a very real and present danger to their lives, that often we tend to have quite a relaxed approach to risks that, whilst are known, are not altogether that common. So, for instance, your house burning down isn't something as common as hitting a pothole on your way to work, right? And so, precisely because we've got such a high I almost want to say tolerance level, but it's almost as if it's a very high threshold of dealing with high stress situations every single day. We forget that these risks are real, albeit they might not be, the incidences might not happen every day, but the risks are very real. And often at the instance at which that risk becomes real in your own life, it is, as was the experience you've mentioned just now, all too often too late. It's one of the challenges I think the sector faces in this particular context in the continent. It is that the sector doesn't have an awareness problem. People are aware, and they're aware that they need it. What it lacks perhaps is the urgency problem. It's that you may be aware, but do you understand the importance and the urgency of buying the product? given how pervasive that risk is.
I mean, Kaz, perhaps we can bring you in here because obviously in South Africa, they always say that if they took the funeral insurance figures out of South Africa's insurance figures, they would look much more like other parts of the continent. Do you think that's because of the type of cover that people choose to buy, that they don't realize the urgency of how it could help them in other situations?
We need to identify firstly which segments of society we're talking about. And if we're talking of segments of society where there's simply no ability to afford it, apart from the fact of recognizing what is most important. And for those folks, maybe it's just about being able to take care of one's death. And where's the ability then to even consider what it is you have in physical assets and to protect that? The issue has always been one for the insurance sector about how do you educate those segments of society about insurance and the importance of it. But I've always felt in my own way that it really comes down to affordability, and whether that in South Africa, the rand that I have in my pocket, do I spend it on purchasing that peace of mind for assets that potentially, if fate came that way, I could decide to lose anyway, and see how I build myself up on the basis of relying on the rest of my community and my immediate family members.
Yes, I mean that's so true in Africa, isn't it? That the cultural thing, if we're allowed to generalize on it, but it's that it is the culture that says that the family will provide and will step up if times go bad, and if not your family, your local community. So it's interesting. I wonder if it is more about affordability or whether it is actually more deep rooted than that. And it's there's also a flip side, isn't there, that where some people kind of think that you're kind of challenging God in some fashion by saying, well, if I buy life insurance, for example, that is going to protect me, my family when I die, are you inviting something bad to happen to you because you've kind of bought the insurance cover? I don't know. It's an interesting dynamic, isn't it, and conundrum for society as a whole.
Would you think that would be the case, Vusi? I wouldn't
I wouldn't.
necessarily think that.
No, I wouldn't either. I mean, I think that so certainly the if the thesis is that people are communal, then it is true that people are communal, and the law and the regulator makes provision for all sorts of schemes that are built on the framework of community, whether you think about a collective investment scheme or several others that are built on the framework of community and the community coming together in the instance where something goes wrong for one of the individuals in that community. And so we know that, and we know that that culture is well entrenched. I do think, though, that there is still, as I say, my own experience is that for most South Africans, in particular in the South African context, but also I spend a lot of time, have businesses in and travel the continent a lot. In fact, probably more often than I do in South Africa, frankly. And I can tell you even there that the lived experience of most people is that there are so many issues that are so clear in their lives and so much more pervasive in their lives as actual challenges and risks that, as I say, it's not a lack of awareness that a person wouldn't have cover, for instance. It's more, do they feel the sense of urgency? And I do still believe, and I will hold to this point, that the industry has, in my mind, an opportunity to bridge that chasm, to communicate not only around, are you aware that this cover exists, but also more importantly around understanding the urgency of why it's important that you have that cover in the first place. You mentioned earlier the funeral insurance industry. They've been very, very good at helping people understand the urgency of it. You just watch their communication campaign and their marketing campaign, and they're very good at understanding the psychology of the buyer and the issues that are attached to the buyer and to that psychology, and framing those in the context that the buyer is able to take action. And I do think that for some of the more complex insurance products, for instance, if you were to compare in this particular instance funeral cover from life insurance, I don't quite see that the life insurance providers understand that in quite the same way. And certainly, if you watch their marketing, branding, and communication, they don't follow the same route in terms of how they frame their communication to the marketplace. And so, whether or not people know, I think the answer is yes. But do they understand the urgency? My sense would be, and I think the numbers would bail this out, that the jury is out on this.
Absolutely. It's interesting about the funeral cover, isn't it? Because people have been persuaded in South Africa to buy that in large numbers, but not elsewhere in the continent. So it does seem to vary market to market enormously. And I wonder if that's, again, just simply the way that the product's marketed.
Can I share an insight on this? Sorry to interrupt you. So I spent yesterday with the second largest funeral insurance business in South Africa. They've had a phenomenal run. I spent it with their board and the founder of that business. They're close on 15 years old now. Then not only are they second largest, but they're also the fastest growing in this, but by a mile. They're number two in terms of their rate of growth, is literally decimals of their rate of growth when you look at what they're doing. And so I was looking at their growth trajectory, their model, their business plan, and where they've grown. And even though they start in this small little place called Hammarsdale in KwaZulu-Natal in the southernmost tip of South Africa in Durban, they have scaled into the rest of South Africa. But listen to this, into the rest of the continent as well. What's been interesting, though, in the rest of the continent, it's actually led with get repatriation cover. So I think this is part of the kind of the dynamic messaging that the industry has to bring in. It's not, when you're selling water in a desert and selling water in Iceland, the messaging around water has to be different because the consumers of that water, dependent on that environment, have different drivers of what would push them to buy the product. And this particular business has been able to do this incredibly effectively. And so they were talking about the numbers they saw and the increase in volumes and their ability to help families in South Africa and in Southern Africa bring family members home from the United Kingdom, for instance, during the instances of COVID. And that growth has been because they've been able to understand the psychology of the buyer. The psychology of the buyer in the rest of Africa might not necessarily be, will my funeral be cared for? If you say this to somebody in Lilongwe in Malawi, it would be laughable because the nature of the people in Lilongwe in Malawi, and I know it, I do business there well, is that a funeral is not carried, the burden of the funeral is not carried by the family, it's carried by the community, literally the cost of their funeral. So the idea that the individual then therefore must provide for the incidence of their death is just something crazy. So it's 3 standard deviations removed from the average. However, because of the economics of that place, it is most certainly likely that somebody from that community lives somewhere else in the world and would need the cover to get them home so that the community can bury them. And I think that's the trick around what the insurance industry can begin to do. It's to understand what are the drivers of the behavior that are key and critical in each specific locale and in each different market, linked to the psychographics of our consumers, around which we can frame a messaging so that we can get further adoption.
Vusi, one of the things I was wondering about was how this conversation changes as Africa as a continent changes. I mean, obviously, we're talking in huge generalizations here because we're talking about the continent as a whole. But there has been this huge move in terms of urbanization, hasn't there? Africa's cities have got a lot bigger and people have left the countryside. Do you think that tailors our conversation around this because maybe they're exposed to advertising and stuff for the first time that they wouldn't have seen when they were living in the countryside?
That's a very good question. So, I run one of the largest, one of the fastest growing venture funds in the continent. So, and one of the funds we have is a fintech fund aimed at growth stage fintech companies. And we've been researching as well as stress testing a model of building a growth stage insurtech fund for the continent. So I know that I've looked at the numbers on this, and the numbers are absolutely fascinating. The rate of urbanization, the drop in the cost of access to internet and telephony and data, the proliferation of smart devices and smartphones, as well as the availability of better quality programming and education that is now easier for consumers to access because of the advent of things like Khan Academy, Udemy, YouTube, and various other platforms. there's been a real bridging of what was this massive space between the third and the first world, insofar as access to technology and infrastructure has been, certainly in the recent past. So we know that there's been that sort of tailwind, if you will, that's been fueling a lot of the adoption. You see it too, isn't it? When you look at the fintech companies and what's been happening with the valuations of fintech companies that are less than a decade old, that are seeing incredible amounts of valuations in the payment space, remittances space, even in blockchain and crypto and a whole host of other platforms. So we do know that there is an appetite across the continent for broader access to financial services broadly. The challenge, I think, insofar as the insurance space is in particular, is that whereas the other product sets and the other solution sets in the financial services space sell a product that answers an existing immediate problem for which there is a relief, insurance sells a promise. And it's that, I think, that there's still perhaps an opportunity for the psychology to bridge that gap, right? So if I download a payment platform, or if I'm using, we see it in one of our businesses where we're paying developers in Nigeria using crypto and blockchain technologies because of the devaluation of their fiat currency, the naira. So these are answering very real, pressing, everyday problems, right? So payment platforms, et cetera, et cetera. But in the insurance space, where we've seen the challenge is that it's that psychology. It's that what I'm buying today, I may or may not need today. We do believe, though, and there are one or two innovations now we're seeing in other parts of the world. We think there'll be great adoption for these as well. This kind of pay as you need insurance, right? So yes, you might buy a long-term insurance product, but on the short term, today, in your little tuk-tuk, as you take to the streets and you're going to be commuting with customers, you need insurance today, and the cost of that insurance today is going to be X amount, say. It might be cents on the dollar. And on a daily basis, as and when you use that asset for the production of income, you might then be able to attach a policy to protect the downside risk of the utility of that asset. So I think that the opportunity is set there, and where the innovators and entrepreneurs and founders need to find space as well as voice and modalities is the model that helps this particular context solve the problem. So it's not just, can you buy insurance online? And we've seen those. There are a number of those, for instance, in South Africa, where you can go in and buy insurance online. It's not just, can the insurance be provided by your peers? We've seen that kind of peer-to-peer crowdsourced insurance as well. But it is more, can you buy the insurance as and when you need it in the production of income, as and when you're producing that income? The greater or less the extent to which the industry is able to accommodate those kinds of innovations. And I say the industry being able to accommodate those kinds of innovations because the industry is also incredibly regulated, right? So, and entrepreneurs, don't like moving into spaces where there's high regulation, because the cost of compliance makes it very difficult to be competitive, because you just haven't achieved the unit economics to be able to absorb that cost structure into your business. So I think all of those are kind of the composite set of factors one has to consider. I fully expect, though, that in the next half a decade, you're going to see an increasing number of these kind of highly innovation-driven startups, Delaware-based, US, Europe capital derived, accessing and unlocking the question of financial inclusion, focusing specifically on the insurance sector, mushrooming all over the place, because we know that the need is there. I think it's just a question of making sure that the need, the product, as well as the price point can connect at the aggregate in the marketplace that's compelling for everybody.
It's so interesting, isn't it? Because I also think that there's perhaps a bit of a Luddite feeling in some quarters of the insurance sector, and it'd be unfair to say across the whole sector. But I was at a conference earlier this week, and they were talking about pay-as-you-go motor insurance, and the lady who sat next to me, who obviously will remain unnamed, just laughed and said that would never work here. And I said, well, why not? It works elsewhere. Why wouldn't it work here? But there was a barrier to accepting a new concept, which I thought was actually a little bit worrying, because I do think that these things will come. And as you say, it could be a US or a European company that can just convert what they're doing elsewhere to the African marketplace. And overtake the local players very quickly.
Yeah.
I mean,
Can I share some insights there?
of course.
So I think that there is, there is credence and credit to that argument. But also, if you look at an example like Jumia, for instance, which launched amongst much fanfare in Africa, it was in effect this kind of online transacting platform, similar to what you would have had as an Amazon, et cetera, et cetera. My exampling here is quite simplistic, but just for the purpose of this conversation. What we've been able to see from that example and the subsequent, when they listed and then the share price absolutely
Hello, family.
tanking from
So many of
Jumia.
you have asked me
And then,
for
of course,
direct
the emergence
mentorship.
of
Now
Conga and
you
several
can
other
get
platforms
it.
take a
Go
lot
to
in South Africa, et cetera, et cetera.
vtclub100.com
What we've been able to
or
see
just hit the link
is
below,
that
really.
in
I'll
the
see you soon.
African context specifically, technology innovation, as well as using technology as an acceleration tool to drive adoption in whatever way, can be inspired by what happens in the rest of the world, but it has to be tailored or customized to the specific nuances of the environment where you are operating. Because the environment does have very specific nuances. So, for instance, it's not uncommon if you are in if I land today in Lusaka in Zambia, and I land at the airport and I'm on my way to a 5-star hotel. Between the airport and the 5-star hotel, I will go across both first and third world realities, just because that's the reality that people are living in. There are places of beautiful, very plush infrastructure, and then there's places of squalor. True too in South Africa. If you land at OR Tambo and make your way to Sandton, you probably got to go past Alexander. If you land at Lansera, you've got to go past Diepsloot. So we know that there are different levels of economic prowess and ability for different consumers in that space. Again, I think that the opportunity here for innovators and people building technologies into the space, in particular in the insurance space, is just make sure that you understand the subtleties and the nuances of the environment where you are operating, because those subtleties and nuances have in the past proven themselves to be the Achilles heel of many very well-intentioned, innovation-driven business models that just missed a little bit about the psychology of the people for whom they were building their product sets.
Absolutely. Final sort of question on this subject. I think there's so much to talk about here. But obviously insurers do spend a lot of money. We've talked about on advertising and marketing. We've talked a lot about that. I'm just wondering whether perhaps they could be more effective by using the journalists more, just to actually spread the word. And could journalists be the new insurance salespeople?
Yeah, I mean that may be the case. It's a very interesting way to think of it, right? Which is could the proverbial holders of the pen on which from which the ink on the piece of paper is drawn be the people who are best able at communicating this? It might be journalists. It may, for instance, be influencers, and rather than the traditional influencer, for instance, which would be somebody sitting in a TikTok account with 200,000 followers, it might more likely be somebody who has a strong following at a local church and who's seen as a leader in that community, who might be a better influencer in terms of driving adoption into those products. And one of the things I think the industry would be well advised to look at is how the multi-level marketing industry does it, because the MLM marketing industry is incredibly effective at understanding in each of the markets where they operate who are the centers of power and influence that can drive consumers to buy products. It's a machine, right? But when you're on the outside, it looks like some sort of amorphous pyramid scheme. It's only when you get inside that you understand that there is actually deep nuance and understanding of how operators of legitimate multi-level marketing scheme companies are able to drive adoption of insurance products by leveraging the power of what an actual influencer is in that environment. So yeah, I suppose the long-winded answer to your question is that journalists may very well be the people who do that. I do though think that in the context of Africa, with the challenges she faces from an infrastructure perspective, from a political maturity perspective, and we're in electioneering season now. So over the next 2 years or so, it's all sorts of elections. We know that Kenya's just had theirs. South Africa's elections are in about 2 years or a year and a half's time. And in between, there are about 8 other nations that are having elections. Journalists in this part of the world tend to have their hands very busy with making sure that that's the stuff that they're covering on the newspapers, or rather the communication they're trying to drive at. So it's not a no. I suppose it's a question of can the voice be found that resonates with the audience?
And actually, that's so true. I know our team of journalists were with the Kenya elections. We lost them for a couple of weeks whilst they were busy counting those votes. I know they do get completely swamped when it comes to election time. But I'm afraid that is all that we've got time for today. We will be back with Vusi because we're going to continue this extremely interesting conversation. For today, thank you everyone for listening, and please let us know what you think. You can email us at info@continental-re.com. And also, if you found today's episode interesting, why not tell a friend or mention us on social media, and make sure you come back and listen to part 2. Thank you.